Hey, in this video, I'm going to be showing you about the lens blur feature in Photoshop and Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. It's a really interesting feature for getting that beautiful background separation, the bokeh or the bokeh, sort of fine-tuned and elevated in your photography without having to get a huge big prime lens. I'll be frank, it's not perfect. You're going to see how I use it and the limitations in this editing tutorial, but nevertheless, it's something you should know about to level up your photography. Okay, so real talk, this is the kind of photo that would just benefit so much by having a 300, 400 f2.8 or something at least f4. But the reality is a lot of us don't shoot with those. They're hard to travel with, they are expensive, but nevertheless, you want that background separation for a shot like this. Like, frankly, to me, the texture, the contrast, even the color of the grasses, mainly the texture, is just, it's distracting from the subject of the image, which is the face, right? You're trying to showcase the face of this cheetah. So this is a case when you want to consider using lens blur in Photoshop, Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw. But the reality is I'm actually showing you an example where it's very tough to make work, just as starters. I'm going to show you another example next of more like the shot you're going to be benefiting from. So we, of course, want the subject to remain sharp. We want the background to be blurred. So I'm in Adobe Camera Raw, but it's the exact same thing for Lightroom. You just scroll to the very bottom, and sometimes you'll see the lens blur collapsed like this. So you just open it up, and then you hit apply. That's how you start. It's that simple. It takes a second to think about it, and then notice the background over here where my mouse is. Boom. Okay, so nice little blur. So I like that. You know, it does something. It doesn't give that really shallow depth of field, like that beautiful f2.8 look, but it does something. But the main thing is the tail really starts to become like silhouetted in a way, like very fake. And even the fringing on the face, like it looks a little bit too sharp, of like a fall off. So again, this is the kind of image you would like to use it for, but you can notice the downsides. I'm just going to walk through a few things of things that I'm looking at and some considerations of how to quote unquote rescue this a little bit, while I'll annotate some of the abilities of this lens blur section. So again, lens blur usually starts at 50, and you can adjust this, of course. So you can go all the way to extremes, and that's the blur we're really looking for. But as you can tell, it just makes everything look kind of worse. The tail is even more defined in terms of that margin against the background. It looks like you snipped it and copied and pasted it on the photo. It doesn't look natural. So we can go back to 50. We can make it look a little bit more natural by going much lighter. And all of a sudden, you know, when we're at 15, maybe even like 20 or so, it's not going to look as bad. In fact, that's where I really start to just kind of notice it. But look at the same time that it doesn't do much for the grass. So we'll turn it off, and it doesn't do all that much. Obviously, it's something. Maybe something's better than nothing, but again, it's kind of tough. Like, you want to use a lot, but it just gets really, really fake. So just for the sake of experimentation, we'll go back to a little bit higher than 50. We'll go to 60. You know, heck, we'll go to 70 just to see if we can rescue this at all. I want to annotate a few of these other things. This is the bokeh section, or the bokeh, tomato in terms of how you pronounce that. And this is more of the quality of the background blur, not so much the background separation or the blur itself. And frankly, I don't mess with these things. If you were a portrait photographer, especially if you're dealing with studio lights or have light bulbs in the background, like you're photographing lights and Christmas lights, you can adjust the quality of the bokeh with all of these, especially with cat eye and bokeh boost. But if you don't have a strong light source in the background, you're not going to see any difference. So I don't touch these for nature and wildlife. Again, if you are photographing models in a studio, if you're photographing, you know, street scenes, night scenes in streets and Christmas lights, things like that, where you do have the light, maybe, but not for this. But what I really want to show you, and I'll show you this again with another example, but is the visualized depth. And this is a really, really important tool, is this allows you to see what the camera is getting in focus and what it's not getting in focus with this analytics. So outside of this bracket is what it's deeming not in focus and what it's treating with the blur, and what is in focus, it's not treating. So there's just no touching of the orange, this sort of reddish, orangish pink. So there are a few things you can do. One is just to hone it a little bit. Again, trying to make this possibly better, is you can narrow this right on the dominant color. And so the dominant color for me around the cheetah head is sort of in around this kind of like orangish pink. So like right around there. And so you could just narrow this a lot so that you have less of a spectrum while making sure your primary area is indeed the part that's not getting the treatment, i.e. is staying in focus. But you can see the tail just happens to be at the right depth, like literal depth away from the lens, that it's getting the same treatment as the face. So we're kind of out of luck here. One other thing you can do, I'll turn visualize depth off, is I can go into refinement and I can actually blur out the tail in a much more acute, much more powerful way than if I were to go through like a normal brush treatment, like a mask. And so we'll blur, and this is my brush size, which is pretty good for what I want. I like a lot of feathering in my masks and brushes just so it's not as harsh. But what I can do here is I can just kind of blur the tail so it looks as if the tail was meant to be out of focus. And I realize you're probably thinking like, this is not a panacea. Like this is weird. Like it's now even more distracting. Like what is it? Is it a tail? Is it like a hallucination of the photo? But that is one thing you can do. And you can of course change this after the fact as well to really blur it out of the scene. But now you almost look like, now it looks like something bleeped in a video or photo that, you know, wasn't meant to be seen. So it looks even weirder. You can go a little bit less just to kind of soften the draw of the eye towards it. But as you can tell, there's still something going on here that I don't really love. But nevertheless, you can see the eyes are sharp, the face is sharp, everything's looking pretty good. I think it's better than nothing, but it is quite distracting. So frankly, if I were really to try to treat this shot, I would look at other images in my sequence that didn't have the tail flipping, or I would just mask out, you know, brush out and remove the tail with some sort of, you know, AI fill, like a generative AI. And that might work, but again, I just wanted to show you this example of when we would like to use it and why it's actually quite challenging to do. So we'll just go ahead and hit cancel here because I really want to show you when it's better to use this. So here we've got another photo, and the key difference here as I pull this up is that I created background separation and blur in camera much better with this shot because I was able to tell my driver guide to pull around to have that distant grassy plain of the Serengeti at a further distance behind the animal. So in the previous cheetah shot, those grasses were like, you know, mere feet away. Now we're dealing with dozens and dozens of yards as far as the background. And even though I'm at a similar aperture, the previous one was 7.1, I'm at 6.3, so not inherently shallow. Because I was able to create more distance in the background, I was able to choose my background, you get a lot more natural blur. And so this is really good for just improving an already, you know, sort of nicely blurred shot. It might take the shot, if we were to say this is like a 7 or 8 out of 10, it'll just bump it up to like an 8 or a 9 out of 10 for me. So we'll do the same process. We'll apply the blur. It'll take a second to think about it. And notice the background. Yep, a little bit more blurred. Now here's the thing, is when you start with a nicely blurred photo that you're really not trying to rescue, is you can really push this a lot more. So watch when I go up to back, you know, the 70, 75, 76. Now you don't see that fringing. You don't see that weirdness with the subject. It looks much more natural. So you can really give it a good treatment. So I'll come back down here and visualize the depth just to make sure I'm spot on and I'm getting the yellows. That's the yellows here. I'm sort of treating the pinks and reds and purples as the background as it should. I could tweak this to try to blur the foreground a little bit and just pull this in slightly, but you got to be so careful with this because then all of a sudden, you know, there might be some whites mixed in with this in this spectrum and you might be blurring your subject. So I wouldn't worry about it much. If you really need to do something here, I would probably do some sort of gradient mask just to sort of darken the foreground in the bottom. But I really like what's going on here. There's of course other editing things I might do, but for the sake of this tutorial, I do like the lens blur feature that's in Lightroom, that's in Adobe Camera Raw. It's nice to use, but as you can tell, it's really only best used when you already have a good starting photo that demonstrates that background separation. So unfortunately, it's not a great rescue tool, but if you want to add some oomph, you already have the right techniques, you create that space in the background naturally in camera, this can help level it up a notch or two. So yeah, ultimately, it's a good tool. It's a newer tool for us, and it's something you should consider with your wildlife photography. But again, the first thing to consider is getting it better in camera. And even with, you know, good old classic 100 to 400, 100 to 500, 100 to 500 at 6.3, it's all about creating that space in the background, making sure you move yourself or your vehicle to get the furthest distance you possibly can behind the subject. So mix that with lens blur, and it's pretty good.